Despite having a somewhat simple playstyle, Phainon's team building has always been remarkably complex. This is due to the way his kit depends so heavily on saving every tiny bit of action value, thus requiring specific speed tuning for maximum potential, as well as the way his kit makes it much easier for people to forgo a sustain to use 3 offensive supports. Thus, the most complicated thing about Phainon has always been which teammates to use him with, and how to use them with him. I have made plenty of videos in the past regarding Phainon's teams and builds, but things have evolved so much for him over the course of his time in the game. So let's cover everything you need to know about the evolution of Phainon's best teams and builds, and what you should invest into if you want to make the best Phainon team possible. But first, a word from the sponsor of today's video. LD Shop is a safe and reliable top-up site that allows you to buy currency across multiple different games, including Honkai Star Rail, Genshin Impact, among other games. They offer prices at a discount, from anywhere up to 13% to 25% cheaper than topping up in-game. Not only are the prices cheaper, but they make topping up completely effortless. All you need is your server and game ID, and you're good to go. No hassle at all, and no personal information required whatsoever. After purchase, you can see that the Jades are sent to my account within 5 minutes. There are no downsides to using LD Shop for your purchases, as the prices on LD Shop are strictly better than the prices in-game. But the upsides don't stop there. Users who register using my link in the description below will get an exclusive 15% and 5% coupon, which can save you up to $50. Additionally, if you spend $80 in total, you can earn an Express Supply Pass for completely free. If you want to top up at discounted prices with no downsides, using a website and method that has been approved as safe by multiple large content creators in the space, then click the link in the description below to head over to LD Shop and start saving money on your gacha game top-ups right away. For a very brief summary of how Phainon's kit works, Phainon revolves around building core flame stacks for his ultimate. He gets core flame stacks whenever an ally targets him with a skill, whenever enemies target him, whenever an ally gives him energy, or whenever he uses his own skill. The goal of Phainon's gameplay is to reach 12 core flame stacks to activate his ultimate so he can enter his god mode. Once he's in his ultimate, he gets 8 actions all within a fixed amount of action value based on his base speed, where he has to manage Scourge stacks to unleash his powerful meteor skill. He gets his Scourge stacks from using his other basic abilities while inside of his ultimate territory. After he's used up all of the actions his ultimate gives him inside of his territory, he exits his ultimate and has to go through the process of stacking up core flame stacks to activate his ultimate all over again. While Phainon is in his ultimate, he sends all of his other teammates into the departed state, essentially meaning he's all by himself against the enemy. Therefore, so much about Phainon's team building is about what his allies can give to him in the brief time where they are on field, and what they can give him while not being present at all, since Phainon gets to keep all buffs on him when he enters his ultimate. Since you want to stack as many buffs on him as possible, and since his teammates are at less risk of dying since they aren't present for a large majority of the battle, Phainon makes it much easier to use 3 offensive supports while ignoring the need for a healer or shielder altogether. Due to this, a lot of Phainon's team building will be assuming the fact that he doesn't need a sustain. Granted, there is still content where a sustain is much more comfortable for Phainon, namely in Anomaly Arbitration, and some people might just be more comfortable using a sustain with Phainon in general, even outside of Anomaly. In these situations, Dan Heng Permancer Terai is the only sustain option that I would recommend for Phainon, and luckily, he's a free unit. Dan Heng provides the most offensive buffs out of any sustain for Phainon, and he's able to keep refreshing his shields while inside Phainon's ultimate, making him the ideal sustain option for Phainon. With that said, Phainon will almost always do more damage by ditching the free sustain to use 3 offensive supports. So if you're facing content where you can get away with not using Dan Heng PT with Phainon, you'll almost always choose to do so. But which offensive supports would you want with Phainon? Given the way his kit works, Phainon can work with most supports that target him with an ability to give him core flame stacks while buffing him, meaning even a super bare bones and free-to-play friendly team like Tingyun, Remembrance Trailblazer, and Branya can work perfectly fine for Phainon. With that said, his more premium options will obviously perform better. First things first, Saridra is always Phainon's best support, literally tailor-made for him. Phainon and Saridra are a package deal, and if you want to upgrade your Phainon team, Saridra is always going to be the first thing you consider pulling for him, no questions asked. Saridra's ability to double Phainon's meteors is by far the strongest thing any support offers to him, since it's one of the few mechanics in the game that's able to interact with him while he's inside of his ultimate. Aside from Saridra, Phainon's team building actually gets a little bit complicated. There are generally 2 different avenues for Phainon teams, assuming Saridra is already being used: Cyrene teams and Sunday teams. But before you even consider one of these 2 paths, there's actually a different path you should consider: Phainon's Eidolons. Phainon is notorious for having by far the most to gain from investing in his Eidolons compared to other characters in Honkai Star Rail, with of course a few exceptions. When it comes to discussing where you should invest your pulls for Phainon, getting Phainon's E2 is more important than any of his other team upgrades. An E2 Phainon with free supports like Tingyun and RMC is going to outperform an E0 Phainon with premium supports like Sunday or Cyrene. As for what Phainon's E2 does, it gives him an additional turn every time he uses his meteor in his ultimate, which translates to more Scourge stacks, which translates to even more meteors. The 20% physical res shred is also obviously very strong from the E2, since Phainon Phainon tends to oversaturate on a ton of other offensive stats, like attack and crit and damage percent. So any source of rare buffs like res pen or defense shred are even more ideal for Phainon than for other DPSs. The E1 is nothing impressive and is mainly only a stepping stone to get to the E2, so never go specifically for the E1 itself. The E2 is the big one for Phainon. Therefore, in a way, you could say that the best way to build Phainon's team is to invest solely into Phainon himself, which is fitting considering his playstyle is all about being solo. Of course, this doesn't mean you never want to invest into his other teammates. All it means is that his strongest investment is to get his E2 first, and then prioritizing his other teammates. I just needed to make sure we covered how strong his E2 is first. If you don't want to get his E2, and you want to know which supports to pull for him instead, because you would rather get more supports for overall account flexibility as opposed to pulling for Phainon Eidolons, then that's totally fair. I already covered how Saridra is a package deal with Phainon, so let's discuss the Cyrene versus Sunday debate. First things first, if you don't currently have Sunday, do not pull Sunday on a rerun just for Phainon. Don't do it. Sunday has a reputation for being more flexible than Cyrene, meaning he has more teams, but the teams that Sunday is flexible in aren't necessarily the greatest teams in the game anymore. So I personally wouldn't rate him higher than Cyrene just for flexibility. In general, cost for cost, meaning if we assume the same investment when comparing Cyrene versus Sunday, Cyrene will always outperform Sunday. Cyrene does require specific speed tuning to feel comfortable in Phainon teams, but you can watch my video all about Cyrene speed tuning with Phainon to get around that. This is why I would never advise you to pull Sunday for Phainon, because using those pulls for Cyrene instead will always be better for Phainon. Of course, it becomes a different story if your account already has both Sunday and his Lightcone and no Cyrene. In that scenario, do you pull Cyrene just for Phainon? No, you'll be fine without Cyrene. However, if you have other Crisis Air teams that can sometimes utilize Cyrene, or just other teams in general that would benefit from you being able to flex your supports between teams, then Cyrene could still be a very beneficial pull to give your account more support variety. And the fact that Phainon can use either Sunday or Cyrene, depending on which support your other team needs, is still helpful. So, to summarize, Saridra is the Phainon support, and I would highly advise every Phainon main who wants him to last in the meta to pull for Saridra. If you just really don't want to pull for Saridra, then that is perfectly fine, but just be aware of the fact that your Phainon is going to quickly start to suffer from the lack of Saridra. This game designs DPSs to often be heavily reliant on at least one specific support, and for Phainon, that support is Saridra. Don't blame me, don't blame Phainon, don't blame Saridra, blame the game for being designed this way. After Saridra, Phainon's best support actually ends up being himself. Getting his first two Eidolons is more important than any other supports. You can argue that getting his E2 is even more important than getting Saridra for him, but Saridra is cheaper since she only requires one 5-star pull, as opposed to Phainon's E2 requiring 2 extra copies of Phainon. So that's why I still prefer to recommend Saridra as the highest priority. And on the topic of investing in Phainon himself before investing in supports, I'm going to give an honorable mention to Phainon's Lightcone here, which I think is the next most important thing for Phainon after Saridra and his own Eidolons. Similarly to Saridra, Phainon's Lightcone is theoretically easier and cheaper to get than his E2. So if you want to go for it before getting his E2, then that's a fair strategy. It all depends on how you want to ration your pull economy between Saridra, Phainon's Lightcone, and Phainon's expensive but powerful E2. Only after securing all of these things would I consider pulling for other characters for Phainon, and even then, Cyrene is the only other character I would recommend. You also don't even have to feel the need to pull for Cyrene if you don't have any other characters that can utilize her, meaning she wouldn't have a lot of flexibility on your account. If you already have Sunday, you also don't have to feel the need to pull for Cyrene just for Phainon specifically. And again, if Sunday gets a rerun banner, do not pull him specifically for Phainon. If you're ever considering pulling Sunday specifically for Phainon, just get Cyrene for Phainon instead. As far as support Eidolons are concerned, Saridra's E1 is very strong for Phainon, for both the defense thread and the ability to give him extra core flame stacks now that her skill gives energy. The core flame aspect of Saridra's E1 loses value if you use a Cyrene team, but it's not a huge deal since Cyrene is still good enough to justify using her. Then there's Cyrene's E2. It will cost a lot of pulls to get Cyrene's E2, and for Phainon specifically, his own E2 is still going to be the most important investment for him. But if you do go for Cyrene's E2, it is very strong for Phainon because of how it gets rid of her biggest issue in Phainon teams, her strict team building requirements to manage her slow ultimate ramp up time. Cyrene's E2 allows you to slot in different teammates with Phainon while still getting all the value that Cyrene brings for Phainon, namely the never-ending ultimate for Phainon. In Anomaly Arbitration especially, Cyrene's E2 can feel as powerful as Phainon's E6 because of the amount of action value it saves. Outside of Anomaly, it's not quite as strong, but it's still the strongest Eidolon for a Phainon support. Though of course, getting E2 on Cyrene is very expensive, so you can always consider it on her rerun if you're even still looking to keep investing into your Phainon team by the time Cyrene reruns. Now, let's talk about some of Phainon's other teammate options, because we've discussed Phainon and Saridra being a package deal with his third best in slot being either Cyrene or Sunday, depending on what you already have, but what about his fourth teammate slot? Well, once again, if you need a sustain, such as in Anomaly arbitration, Danheng PT is your default option. If you don't need a sustain, the best final slot is going to fall into a spectrum of damage versus core flame stacks, depending on what you need. On one side of the spectrum, we have supports like Tribby and Cypher, who give 0 core flame stacks, but provide the biggest damage buffing for Phainon. This is because, as we discussed earlier, Phainon oversaturates so heavily on attack and damage percent and crit buffs, meaning he gets so many of those types of buffs from other sources, that the rare and unique res pen and vulnerability buffs from Tribby and Cypher are the biggest way to increase Phainon's damage at the cost of giving no stacks for his ultimate. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Bronya, who provides much less damage buffing, actually being similar to a sustain like Danheng PT's damage buffing, but she provides the most amount of core flame stacks thanks to her action advance. In between, we have characters like Remembrance Trailblazer and Ruan Mei, who are a middle ground in the spectrum of damage versus core flame stacking. The character you use in Phainon's last slot is going to depend on which you need more, which can largely depend on whether or not the enemies you're going to fight can reliably hit Phainon to generate extra core flame stacks for him. If you're using a Cyrene team, then core flame stacks no longer matter, and instead, you just need to make sure you're using a Chrysos Heir in the last slot for Cyrene. RMC is the best option for smoothing out Cyrene's ramp up time, but technically you can make any of the other Chrysos Heir support options work in that last slot as well, with Tribby becoming the definitive best slot if Cyrene is E2 and no longer has ramp up issues. For a more in-depth guide on how to build a Cyrene team with Phainon, watch this guide video of mine to get a better understanding of the full Phainon and Cyrene team rotation. If you aren't using Cyrene, then I always lean towards the comfort of higher core flame stack generation from the likes of Bronya, unless you're going into a fight where you can reliably depend on enemy RNG to keep hitting Phainon so that Phainon can cheat out core flame stacks that way without dying. As you can see, there's always a lot to consider when it comes to Phainon team building, which is part of the fun of his character. Now, to bring up Saridra's E1 once again, the strength of Saridra's E1 is that it allows you to mostly lean away from the core flame stacking supports and prioritize the higher damage supports instead, such as Tribby, Cypher, or Ruan Mei. Ruan Mei especially becomes very strong for Phainon if she has her E1 to stack defense thread with Phainon, but of course Tribby's E1 would swing things back in her favor. Either way, the ability to utilize these stronger buffing supports for Phainon without needing to worry about core flame stacks is the power of Saridra's E1. And again, Cyrene teams negate this because core flame stacks stop mattering in a Cyrene team. Cyrene teams are all about stacking Cyrene's ultimate instead of Phainon's, but it's fine that Cyrene renders the core flame stacks from Saridra's E1 useless since, again, Cyrene is generally strong enough to justify it. Just make sure you know what you're getting out of Saridra's E1 if you're going to consider pulling it. Outside of Cyrene teams, it's huge. Inside of Cyrene teams, it's not as crazy and mainly just functions as a defense threading buff for Phainon, which is still great, but just not as gameplay changing as it is in non-Cyrene teams. So to summarize, Phainon's team building priority looks something like this. At a baseline, we'll assume the most free-to-play friendly team possible of Phainon, Tingyun, Bronya, and RMC. Danheng PT will always be a consideration if you need to sustain, so just keep that in mind, and we aren't going to mention him again. Additionally, if any of these steps requires a character you just don't want to pull for, then that's completely fine. This is just the optimal path to upgrading Phainon, but not a necessity. Now, if this is your starting team, the very first thing you want to do is replace Tingyun with Saridra. Then, before kicking out any of the other teammates, investing further in Phainon will give him the biggest damage increase possible. Phainon's signature Lightcone is the perfect mix of a strong increase, while also being less expensive than investing in his Eidolons. But the strongest upgrade for Phainon is technically getting his E2, so you can decide how you want to prioritize your investment between those considerations. Phainon's E1 is negligible, and you should only think of it as a stepping stone to get to his E2. Stopping at Phainon's E1 without his E2 is not going to do much for you, which is why you might consider getting his signature Lightcone instead if you can't guarantee getting to his E2. Either way, once you've decided how to invest into your Phainon, or maybe you've decided not to invest in his Eidolons at all because you're not a player who pulls for Eidolons, which is completely valid, the next slot we're looking to replace is the Bronya or RMC slot. If you already have Sunday on the account, then Sunday can replace either of them to round out the team. Then, you can consider pulling Saridra's E1 to replace the final slot with a stronger buffer like Tribby, or Cypher, or E1 Ruan Mei, who is technically a somewhat free character due to being in the Golden Companion shop. If you don't have Sunday, do not pull Sunday just for Phainon, unless you just really love Sunday, in which case, do whatever you want. Instead of pulling Sunday to round out this team, your eyes should be moving towards Cyrene instead to round out the Phainon team, replacing Bronya. Then, before you ever start considering getting signature Lightcones for Saridra or Cyrene, you should consider their Eidolons instead. Saridra's E1 is once again still very strong, despite Cyrene making the core flame stack generation useless. As for Cyrene, she's in the exact same position as Phainon when it comes to Eidolon investment, where her E2 is the really big one, and her E1 doesn't do anything for Phainon. So you really need to consider how many pulls you're able to spend, and if you're able to make it all the way to the E2. Only after considering these things would I consider Saridra and Cyrene's Lightcones. But these are the least important parts of the puzzle, and more of just the final things you invest into if you have nothing else to pull. If you do get Cyrene's E2, then RMC becomes very replaceable with the likes of Tribby or even Cypher. And technically, Tribby and Cypher are still usable here faster even with E0 Cyrene, albeit her ultimate rotation won't be as fast without RMC action advancing her, but that's alright. Now, if you want to invest even further, the only thing left that I can suggest is, I guess, Phainon's E6? But just know that Phainon's E6 loses some of its value with Cyrene because the starting core flame stacks are meaningless, since Cyrene does not care about Phainon's core flame stacks and only cares about her own ultimate stacks, since she'll activate his ultimate for free anyway. And on that note, if you already have Phainon's E6, Cyrene's ramp up time is too slow compared to how fast Phainon can rotate through his own ultimate at E6, and so she only becomes more worth it for Phainon E6 once she's E2. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about whaling your Phainon to super high investment in Eidolons. I understand you. My Phainon is also E6, but you definitely do not need to invest this far to see good results. I promise you'll be fine sticking at lower investment. I just wanted to put this section here for the people who are like me and have or will have higher investment Phainons. So that's mostly all there is to say about Phainon's team building. But how about Phainon's relic building? What ideal stats are needed on Phainon and his teammates? And how does it change depending on which team you're using? Well, Phainon's stat priority is fairly simple. The ideal crit ratio is a 1-to-2 ratio, meaning your crit damage should be around double your crit rate. Phainon's ideal crit rate hovers around 80%. So for a starting out stat line, your Phainon should have 80 crit rate and 160 crit damage. This is just for a mediocre build. If you want your Phainon to approach good territory, then his crit damage should be even higher, nearing 180 to 200. Now, you may ask, how is this even possible? That's a lot of crit stats. And, well, need I remind you that Phainon gets 12 crit rate and 37 crit damage just from his stat traces, as well as 16 crit damage from his best in slot relic set. There's an abundance of ways to get crit stats on Phainon, so I promise it isn't as difficult as it may seem. Just keep farming and working on his build to get him to this ideal stat line. In order to help reach this stat line, use either a crit rate or crit damage body, whichever stat needs help more. His boots are a complicated subject. There are scenarios where you can run speed boots, which we'll discuss in a second, but generally I would always run attack boots. His orb can be either physical damage orb or attack orb. The difference is really small, and substats matter more. And then the rope should always be attack, since none of the other rope stats are useful for him. As you can see, it's basically the same way you would build any other DPS. His best in slot relic set is the Wave Strider set. You can use 2-piece sets with offensive stats as a placeholder, or Scholar, since the Scholar domain is very efficient to farm, but I would highly recommend Wave Strider as the end goal for your Phainon. His planet ornaments can either be Rudolent Arena or Arcadia. The difference between these two is very small and can very easily be substat dependent. With perfect substats, Arcadia is a little better, but Rudolent makes building your crit ratio a bit easier. For his Lightcone, his signature Lightcone is obviously his best, and it isn't just due to the damage increase. His Lightcone's base speed buff is one of the only ways in the game to make Phainon move faster during his ultimate's territory state. You see, speed buffs don't affect his speed during his ultimate's turns, but since the interval of his ultimate's turns are based on his base speed, anything that increases his base speed does speed up his ultimate's turns. I know it's a little bit confusing, but essentially the only way to speed up Phainon's turns while inside of his ultimate is his Lightcone and his E1. Aside from his Lightcone, Dan Heng Imbiber Lunai's Lightcone is actually his second best in slot, although do note that it is still quite far behind his signature. The high base attack and crit stat stick on this Lightcone helps a lot, so even though the energy is useless on him, it's still better than his free-to-play options by a little bit. You will need to weave in a basic attack if you want the rest of this Lightcone's buffs, however. For your free-to-play option, the Hertostor Lightcone on the Fall of an Aeon is a reliable and fantastic free destruction Lightcone, as always. Before we talk about how to build his teammates, let's discuss those scenarios where you would consider speed boots on Phainon. We've already established that the only way to speed up Phainon's turns inside of his ultimate is via buffs to his base speed, so speed boots actually do not speed up his ultimate's turns. The reason we would consider speed boots is if we need them in order to build up enough core flame stacks while outside of Phainon's ultimate. The simplest way to get Phainon's core flame stacks is by playing him in a -1 speed setup with the likes of Bronya or Sunday. So for example, with a 136 speed Phainon and a 135 speed Sunday, so that Phainon can skill for core flame stacks, and then Sunday immediately brings them back up to skill again for even more stacks. This isn't always the optimal speed tuning for Phainon, it's just an example of one of the simple ways to maximize Phainon's core flame stacking. Phainon with his signature Lightcone and speed boots actually reaches exactly 136 speed, which is convenient. However, if you have Saridra, she gives 20 speed, which makes up for speed boots. This means I would never use speed boots on Phainon if you're using him with Saridra, because Saridra can enable the -1 speed setup with Sunday or Bronya, even without speed boots. It should also be noted that the usual 134 speed breakpoint isn't relevant for Phainon teams in most scenarios. The 134 speed breakpoint allows characters to take 2 turns in the first cycle, but since Phainon's goal is generally to get his ultimate within 1 rotation from his team, you'll be fine going a bit under 134 speed, so long as the order of turns is correct if you're using a -1 speed setup with an action advancer. So, to summarize, the only scenario where you would use speed boots on Phainon is if you do not have Saridra, and if you're trying to play Phainon in a -1 speed setup with Sunday or Bronya. The alternative would be to play Sunday and Bronya at hyperspeed with above 160 speed, in which which case you can keep Phainon on attack boots. If you want a complete guide on the speed tuning thresholds, you can watch this guide that I made before Saridra released, and everything here will still be accurate for non-Saridra teams. However, do note that this video was made to optimize the speed requirements in order to zero cycle, and zero cycling without Saridra is just not the norm for Phainon nowadays, so you can lower the speed requirements from this video as much as you want. If you don't care about zero cycling, then the most important thing is always to follow the order in which characters take turns, not the specific speed breakpoints themselves. As long as your characters are taking turns in the correct order, you'll be fine. But that video technically is outdated because Saridra now exists. So if you want a guide to Saridra rotations, you can watch this video that I made for speed tuning Phainon teams with Saridra. Long story short, it's the exact rotation we spoke of earlier, where Phainon uses attack boots and utilizes the 20 speed buff from Saridra to go before Sunday and or Branya. Phainon can be at base speed, so as long as the action advancer is just a little bit slower than Phainon, once Phainon has Saridra's speed buff, you'll be good to go. Saridra on Vonwhack is really nice for giving more core flame stacks or for generating more skill points for the team, so that's the only real quirk about the relic building that I would note. And then there's Cyrene teams. In terms of relic building, there isn't much to mention here for Phainon. Just leave him at base speed, no speed stats required. Check out my recent Cyrene rotations video for an in-depth guide on how to speed tune Cyrene teams to rotate through her ultimate quickly, so that it isn't nearly as much of an issue as people would have you thinking it is. The last thing I want to touch on is Phainon's crit rate. The reason I suggest building around 80 crit rate for Phainon is because the actual goal is to get as close to 100 crit rate as possible for the most consistent damage. Phainon's different teams have a lot of different ways to get crit rate though, whether it be Sunday's 20 crit rate buff, Cyrene's 16 crit rate buff, RMC's 10 crit rate buff, or a mix of these together. Build your Phainon's crit rate around these crit rate buffs to get it as close to 100 as possible. That is the goal with Phainon's crit ratio. In summary, the most complicated part about building Phainon is his teammate options. Saridra is always his best in slot support, and without her, your Phainon will not see his full potential. After that, Phainon's own personal investment into his Eidolons and signature Lightcone is the biggest increase for him. Then, if you're looking to pull an additional support for him, Cyrene is the way to go. If you already have Sunday, then he can replace Cyrene, but do not pull Sunday just for Phainon in this day and age. Also, I wouldn't recommend using Cyrene and Sunday together, since Cyrene heavily incentivizes a full Crisis Era team. If you don't have and don't want either Cyrene or Sunday, then Phainon can get by with free-to-play options like RMC or Branya, or even Ting Yun. Speed buffs aside from his E1 and Lightcone don't impact him, so don't use speed buffers like Hanya or Asta. Dan Heng Permancer Terai can always be considered if you need to use a sustain with him, but you may need to rely on enemy RNG to hit Phainon to get enough core flame stacks because Dan Heng is so bad at generating core flame stacks. Phainon's stat priority is fairly straightforward, focusing on crit and attack stats just like every other attack scaling main DPS. He has relic sets that were specifically released alongside him, tailor-made for him as well, so use Wave Strider as his 4-piece, plus either Arcadia or Rudolent as his planner ornament. There are some situations where you can consider speed boots, but I generally don't recommend it, especially since I recommend Saridra so highly for Phainon, and Saridra always negates the need for speed boots. Overall, Phainon is a very strong character with a simple playstyle, but a surprising amount of complexity in his team building. The best Phainon team right now does use Saridra and Cyrene, but Cyrene isn't needed by any means, and she definitely isn't the #1 priority for Phainon over getting Saridra and Phainon's own Eidolons. As for whether or not you should pull Phainon in today's current meta, Phainon is very strong for players who are lower in investment and don't care about zero cycling content because his baseline free-to-play support options work so well with getting him up and running. However, Honkai Star Rail is unfortunately a game where you're generally incentivized to go all in for full teams. So if you start putting together the really strong complete teams of other characters, like the Remembrance team, then Phainon can start to fall behind until you invest more heavily into Phainon's own Eidolons. In general, if you have no plans to pull Saridra, then I would probably also reconsider pulling for Phainon, as the two of them really do feel like a package deal. But obviously, if you just want Phainon because you love him and because he's the GOAT of Amphorius, then you're completely valid. And I hope this guide has managed to help you feel more confident in pulling for and building him. The meta is probably very close to shifting away from the Crisis eras and into a new era of new characters with the next world right around the corner. So I would only recommend pulling for any of the Crisis eras, Phainon included, if it's to show your love. And with that, unless Phainon gets some additional support in the future, this is probably my final full guide on Phainon. Since his team building can be so complex, I have made so many videos dedicated to Phainon and all the things you need to consider when playing him, so check out the videos I linked in the description of this video if you want to check out my past Phainon guides. If you found this guide helpful or enjoyable at all, consider liking the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more content like this. Trust me, when Saridra's rerun is announced, I will definitely be making an updated Saridra video, which will sort of be another Phainon video in disguise. But what are your thoughts on Phainon as a whole? Not just his kit. I would love to hear about your full thoughts on Phainon as a character, now that Amphorius and Phainon's character have come to a close. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you, and my arms are always open to welcome every Phainon enjoyer. But with all of that said, until next next time!